The envelope was heavier than it should have been. Not in ounces or grams, I mean in weight of presence. Certified mail, Spokane postmark, signed for by a courier who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He didn't even linger for a tip. Just shoved the thing into my hands, had me scribble on his tablet, and was already halfway down the hallway before I'd even closed my door. I carried it inside like it might bleed ink, sat down at my kitchen table, brushed aside bills and junk mail, and opened it. Inside, 3 brass keys on a ring, an old photograph of a fire lookout tower against a backdrop of jagged peaks, and a folded piece of stationery that smelled faintly of cedar smoke. The stationery had one line typed in uneven ink. You'll want to read the rules before sunset. No salutation, no name, just that. I spent half the afternoon turning those words over in my head. By the time I reached the bottom of the envelope and pulled out the sheaf of legal documents, my hands had gone clammy. The letterhead read Granger, Wilcox and Associates, Spokane, WA. Somewhere between my first and second cup of bitter coffee, I realized what it was: an inheritance. The estate of one Marcus Alvarez, recently deceased. According to the papers, Marcus had been my uncle, my father's brother. I stared at that name. My last name, Alvarez. But I'd never heard of Marcus. My father had never spoken of a brother. I called the law office. A receptionist with a clipped accent answered on the second ring. "Mr. Wilcox has been expecting your call." The next day I sat across from a man so thin he looked like paper folded into a suit. Wire-rimmed glasses, steady hands. His office smelled like lemon oil and restraint. "Your uncle was an unusual man," Wilcox began, sliding a folder across the desk. "He lived alone for many years. The property is remote. A fire lookout tower, technically, converted into a residence." "Why me?" I asked. "Because you're his blood and because your father was explicitly excluded." I didn't push, I didn't want to know. Wilcox tapped the folder. "You'll find maps, coordinates, and a deed. The taxes are paid for 5 years, no mortgage. There's also this." He slid across a small padded envelope. My name typed in block letters. I tore it open. Inside, the 3 brass keys, cool and heavy in my palm. One for the front door, one for the utility hatch. The third, Wilcox paused. "Well, Mr. Alvarez didn't say. What happens if I don't want this?" "You can sell it. It's valuable property. Remote but pristine wilderness." I thought about my cramped apartment, my accounting job that felt like quicksand, and the hole in my life since Lillian died. Maybe a change of scenery wouldn't be the worst thing. The highway north from Spokane blurred into long stretches of pine and asphalt. Civilization thinned mile by mile. First suburbs, then logging trucks, then nothing but trees and road. I stopped once in a small town for gas and stale coffee. The clerk, a woman with weather-cracked skin and eyes like she'd seen one winter too many, eyed the coordinates I slid across the counter. "You headed up Whitlow?" she asked. I nodded, her lips pressed thin. "Don't stay after dark." She counted my change slow, like each coin weighed her down. When I asked what she meant, she only shook her head. By the time I left pavement for dirt, the sun was dropping lower. The road narrowed until it was barely more than a logging trail. My rental car groaned over ruts and potholes, suspension screaming like it knew something I didn't. The GPS died 20 miles back. I followed a photocopied map Wilcox had given me, squinting at hand-sketched arrows. Finally, just as I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, the trees opened into a clearing. And there it was. The Whitlow lookout rose like a relic. A tall, square-legged tower, its cabin perched on stilts high above the clearing. Wooden stairs spiraled upward, each tread worn hollow by decades of boots. The roof pitched steep, a chimney stabbing skyward, and the windows, there were so many windows. I counted as I climbed. One for each side, doubled at the corners. Too many. At the top, the door opened with a reluctant squeal. Inside smelled of cedar and long-cooled smoke. A desk sat in the center, bolted to the floor, ringed by glass panes that made the whole place feel like a lantern. A cot in one corner, a cast-iron stove in another. Dust floated in late afternoon beams. And under the desk, taped crooked with yellowed Scotch tape, I found them. The rules, typed on brittle paper, edges curling. Rule #1, cover all mirrors and glass. I looked up. 12 windows, bare, clear, staring out over the valley like watchful eyes. I dropped my pack, tested the stove, checked the cot. Everything worked. Everything seemed almost maintained. But I couldn't shake the words, cover all mirrors and glass. I had one spare sheet in my pack. I draped it over the western window, the one bleeding orange from the setting sun. It covered maybe half the glass. The others I left bare. The wind outside shifted, threading through the trees, then stopped, dead. I stood in silence, so thick my own breathing sounded like intrusion. And that was when I saw it. In the reflection of the western pane, the mountains lined the horizon. 9 jagged peaks. But in the glass there were 10. A summit that didn't exist in the real skyline. I blinked, leaned closer. And in that moment, the last thread of wind died completely. The trees outside froze. Even the air in the tower felt still, as if the world had been paused by an unseen hand. The 10th peak lingered in the reflection, sharp and black against the fading light, watching me. I barely slept after the 10th peak. Even with the windows covered, I felt like something was watching from just beyond the glass. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that impossible mountain lingering in the reflection, sharp and black. By morning, the forest had returned to normal. Birds trilled, wind stirred through the trees. For a moment, I let myself believe it had all been exhaustion. But then I found the radio. It was tucked in the cabinet beneath the desk, an old Forest Service model with dials yellowed from age and a microphone bound in tape. I turned the knob, static flooding the tower like breath through rotten teeth. Channel 1, Channel 2, nothing. Then Channel 11, the static bent, curled, and a voice came through. Evan, I froze. Nobody here should know my name. The voice crackled again. Evan, you still listening? I set the mic down like it might burn me. When I bent to shove the radio back into the cabinet, I saw another sheet of paper taped under the desk. Rule #2, never answer after 11 p.m. That single line hollowed me out. Someone had known this radio would speak. Someone had written a time down precise as a curse. I told myself I wouldn't touch it again, but boredom turned into curiosity, and curiosity always rots into temptation. That night, I sat by the lantern with the mic coiled like a snake beside me. At 11 o'clock, the speaker hissed, Evan, you remember Spokane? My chest clenched. Spokane was where I'd done my EMT internship. You remember that alley call, kid with the crushed chest? I was there, Ev. The air left me. Whoever this was, whatever this was, it knew. The voice softened, persuasive. You froze just a minute too long. You've carried it ever since. I can take that from you. Just say yes. Just tell me you want forgiveness. My hands shook. The time glowed on my phone screen, 11:10. The voice was almost kind. You were a good medic, you tried, that's enough. Let me absolve you, Evan, let me in. At 11:11, the forest outside silenced in a single breath. Even the trees seemed to hold still. Then the voice changed. "Come on, rookie." The word shattered me. Luis Ortega had called me that, my first partner on the ambulance, who had bled out after a crash 3 years ago. His last words had been, "Stay with me, rookie." Now that same voice came steady through the radio, alive again, impossible. "Rookie," it said, "you listening?" The mic rattled in its cradle, like something had touched it from the other side. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The voice already knew where to find me. The voice from the radio still haunted me the next morning. I tried not to look at the mic, but every time my eyes drifted to it, I remembered the last word, "rookie." Lewis's voice speaking through a dead channel. I almost convinced myself it had been in my head. A hallucination born of exhaustion, maybe. But when I checked the desk again, the rule was still there, yellowed and curling beneath old tape. Rule #2. Never answer after 11 p.m. The specificity of it proved I wasn't losing my mind. Someone had known this was coming. Someone had lived through it before me. That afternoon I made myself busy. I cleaned dust from the corners, checked the stove, reinforced what little covering I'd managed on the windows. By the time dusk slanted orange across the tree line, I was exhausted but restless, like a soldier waiting for orders. The sound came just as I was pulling my jacket tighter. A single metallic clack. It came from the trapdoor in the floor, the one that led out to the catwalk circling the tower. I froze, staring at the boards beneath my feet. The air around me seemed to still. The rule taped just below the second one drifted back into my memory. Rule #3. Do not step onto the catwalk if the trapdoor unlatches on its own. I crouched low and stared. The iron latch on the trapdoor trembled once, then lifted. The hatch cracked open an inch, sighing cold air up into the cabin. My breath smoked even though the stove still radiated heat. On instinct, I tried the third key on the hatch lock, anything to reassert control. The teeth scraped uselessly. It didn't fit. I forced myself not to touch the door again, not to close it. The rule hadn't said to fix it, only not to step outside if it opened. But the opening gaped like a wound. I couldn't keep my eyes off it. I don't know how long I stayed there waiting before I noticed the smell. Smoke. Not fresh smoke, not the sharp bite of a new fire, but something older. Ashy, stale, like a campfire long since dead. Curiosity dragged me toward the nearest window. I pulled back the edge of the blanket covering the glass and looked down at the clearing below. Footprints. They circled the base of the tower, stamped deep in pale ash. But there had been no fires here. Not recently. Not for years, according to Wilcox's briefing. The tracks were small, uneven, and led directly to the stairs that spiraled up toward me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the cot. My pulse rattled so loud I could barely hear the next sound. A knock. Gentle, deliberate. It came from the outside glass. I turned, every nerve in my body screaming. The window pane rattled once more, 3 soft taps. But when I pulled the blanket aside, the catwalk outside was empty. The trapdoor in the floor yawned open behind me, waiting. By the 4th night, I'd stopped pretending I could ignore the rules. They weren't just warnings. They were survival steps. Cover the glass, don't touch the radio after 11. Never step onto the catwalk if the hatch opened by itself. Each one felt less like a guideline and more like the thin thread keeping me from falling into something I couldn't name. The next rule had been typed on its own slip of paper. The ink faded but still sharp enough to unsettle me. Rule #4. At civil twilight, count 9 peaks. nothing else, no explanation. The lookout sat in a perfect vantage point, ridges rolling out in every direction. From the windows I could see miles of jagged tree line and the teeth of the mountain range. 9 summits stood like sentries along the horizon. Always 9. But that night, as the sun bled down into the tree line and twilight spread across the valley, I pulled out the old Osborne fire finder bolted to the middle of the tower. It was a brass circle with sights for measuring distances and azimuths, once used to track smoke columns. The lens had been polished, almost unnaturally clear. I braced my elbows and began to count, tracing each peak slowly left to right. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. My chest loosened when I hit the familiar number. Then something blinked on the far horizon. At first, I thought it was lightning, but the sky was clean, cloudless. It blinked again, steady and rhythmic, like a lighthouse sweeping its beam across the sea. Except there was no sea here, only mountains. And when I lined the fire finder with that faint flash, I saw it, a 10th peak. It hadn't been there a moment ago, and yet it was solid, sharp-edged, impossibly black against the dim sky. I blinked, checked with my naked eyes. Nothing but 9 peaks. But through the lens it loomed. My hands shook as I adjusted the focus. Something stood on the crest. Not a tree, not a rock, something tall. It didn't sway with the wind because there was no wind. It didn't shift like an animal. It simply stood upright, too still, too patient. And then it moved. Not down into the valley, not across the ridges. It moved sideways, sliding between one summit and the next without crossing the space that separated them. Distance simply refused to matter. The fire finder lens fogged for just a second, as though something had breathed against it from the wrong side of the glass. When it cleared, the figure was gone. But the 10th peak remained. By the 5th evening, I had already memorized the ridge lines. 9 peaks, always 9 with the naked eye, 10 through the Osborne lens. The memory of that thing stepping sideways between mountains stayed lodged in me like a splinter I couldn't pull out. When I tried to distract myself, I went back to the rules. 1 through 4 etched into my head. But now my eyes kept drifting to the next one taped crookedly under the desk. Rule #5. Do not believe anyone who says they are Whitlow. It seemed almost laughable. Whitlow was the name of the ridge, the old fire district, maybe the town that had once existed here, not a person. And yet the rule sat there, typed decades ago on fading paper, waiting for me to need it. The need came faster than I wanted. Just before dusk, when the last edge of sunlight burned low on the horizon, I heard a voice. Not through the radio this time, outside. I crept to the window, pulling back the blanket an inch. At the base of the tower stood an older man. He wore a forest green cardigan over khaki pants, his silver hair neat, his posture calm, almost grandfatherly. In one hand he held a ranger's cap, the kind they'd worn in the old black and white photos nailed to the wall inside. His voice carried up the tower with unnatural clarity. "Evan," he called, looking straight up at me. "It's me, Whitlow." Rules hammered in my skull. Don't believe anyone who says they are Whitlow. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "I know your father. I know about the fight he had with your uncle, the reason Marcus cut him out of the will. I can tell you everything." My stomach twisted. Nobody should know those details, not unless they were family, not unless they'd been there. I stepped back from the glass. The figure kept talking, voice soothing, almost hypnotic. "You don't have to stay here. Evan, this place isn't a prison, it's a test. Let me in and I'll explain. I'll tell you what the 10th peak really is. I'll tell you why the glass whispers at night. You don't have to be afraid anymore." For one breath I almost believed him. Then the radio behind me snapped to life with a burst of static. Channel 11 hissed, cleared, and a second voice came through. "Evan," it said, calm, steady. "It's me, Whitlow." I spun between the window and the radio. One Whitlow calling from the base of the tower. Another Whitlow speaking through the static at the same time. Both voices knowing my name. Both voices waiting for me to choose. By the sixth morning, I was running on less than scraps of sleep. The man or men who claimed to be Whitlow still haunted me. Their words echoed in my head, layered like bad radio static. Sometimes I wondered if they were still standing out there beneath the tower, waiting for me to give in. I checked the desk again, hoping I'd imagined it, but Rule #6 had been there all along. Rule #6. Leave a cup of water on the sill at dawn. It sounded almost harmless compared to the others. Cover glass, don't answer the radio, don't step onto the catwalk. This was simple. A ritual like an offering, I could handle that. At the first light of day, I filled one of the chipped enamel mugs from the kitchen sink and set it carefully on the windowsill facing east. My breath fogged in the chill morning air as I whispered, though I didn't know to whom, there. The sun crawled higher. I turned away to stir the stove. When I glanced back, the cup was gone. Not spilled, not tipped, gone. My pulse climbed into my throat. I rushed to the sill, half expecting to see it shattered on the ground below. But wedged into the corner of the frame, tight enough it must have been forced there, was the same enamel cup, now packed solid with ice. I touched it, and a numbness bit my fingers instantly. The air around it smelled faintly clean, like snow melt. I wanted to throw it out, but the rule didn't say to. The rule only said to leave the cup at dawn, and it was still there. Changed, but there. All through the day I caught sounds outside the tower, slow movements circling in the underbrush, branches breaking when there was no wind, the occasional soft patter like bare feet in dirt. Whatever was out there, the water seemed to keep it satisfied enough not to try the door. By dusk I was exhausted. My nerves buzzed like live wires. When I finally sat on the cot, I realized the air had grown colder, far colder than the stove should have allowed. A crackling sound drew my eyes downward. Frost was forming across the floorboards, spiderwebbing outward from where my boots rested. The enamel cup still sat on the sill, packed with ice, but now a ring of frost was blooming across the cabin floor, tightening in a circle around my legs. When I tried to move my feet, the boards clung slick with thin ice, holding me in place. I wrenched my boots free with a sound like tearing paper, the ice splintering around my ankles. My socks were soaked through, my toes numb and aching. I staggered back toward the stove, teeth clicking against each other as though I'd stepped out into January wind instead of standing inside four walls with a fire going. The enamel mug on the sill sat innocent, rim glazed with rime. I wanted to smash it, throw it out into the clearing, and let whatever circled out there know I wasn't playing its game. But every time I thought of lifting it, the rule pinned under the desk burned itself into my mind like a warning flare. Leave a cup of water on the sill at dawn. Not take it back. Not discard it. Leave it. I huddled by the stove until the frost faded from the floorboards. By then, the sun was almost gone, and I knew night would bring worse things than ice. That night passed in fragments of sound and silence. The scrape of something on the catwalk rails, the whisper of movement in the trees. At one point, the radio whispered without static, as though the voices didn't even need the pretense of interference anymore. I didn't answer. I pressed my palms against my ears and prayed for dawn. When the sky finally bled gray again, I was still alive. My first thought was of the mug. The ice was gone. The enamel was bone dry, and in its place, wedged under the sill where the mug had been, I saw paper. I pried it free with shaking fingers. It wasn't just one page. It was a bundle of them, bound with twine, edges flaking like they'd been pulled out of fire. When I untied the cord, a small ledger unfolded, pages charred at the corners but words still legible. The handwriting was cramped, rushed, and not my uncle's. Older, maybe. Generations older. August 1923. The water keeps them circling. Do not fail to leave it. One morning I forgot. The ice formed inside just as it has for you. They nearly breached before sunset. The sill is not just an offering, it is a lock. I flipped further. September 1923. They walk in ash though no fires burn. Their steps leave no mark in dirt, only the black powder. Where it comes from I cannot say, but I know this. When the ash begins to creep indoors, the barrier is thinning. I set the ledger down and realized my hands were trembling. My eyes darted instinctively to the floor. Ash. At first I thought it was dust from the stove, but no. The flakes on the boards were darker, softer, like residue from burned wood. I traced a finger through it and left a gray streak across my skin. My stomach dropped. The footprints I'd seen outside days before hadn't been hallucinations. They hadn't been tricks of light. Something had been walking in ash that didn't belong to this forest. The ledger slipped from my grasp and hit the floor, scattering ash that hadn't been there a moment before. And then, before I could even stoop to gather it, something tapped the window. Gentle, patient. I turned. Through the blanket covering the pane, a shape pressed against the glass from outside. Long fingers leaving black smears that trailed downward as though dipped in soot. I forced myself not to scream, not to acknowledge it, not to pull the blanket away. But the tapping came again. And when I finally glanced down, I saw that the ring of ash wasn't just forming outside the tower anymore. It was curling in a circle on the cabin floor around my boots. I had convinced myself I could juggle the rules. One at a time, they felt survivable. Cover the mirrors. Don't answer after 11:11. Leave the water. Each was a single nail hammered into the coffin, but not yet shut tight. But that night the rules turned against each other. It began with the windows. The blankets I'd nailed up had been enough so far, dim silhouettes, faint glow of lantern light filtering through, nothing reflective left to betray me. I was sitting at the desk with the ledger open when the air shifted. The fire still burned, but the cabin dimmed as if someone had cupped the tower in two enormous hands. I glanced up and saw blackness bleeding through the fabric. Not shadow, not the night. This was heavier, thicker, like oil soaking through cloth. One by one, the windows lost their dull glow and became solid mirror-dark panels, their surfaces pulling at the light like tar. I pressed my eyes shut. I knew what Rule Hash once said: cover mirrors, cover glass, don't look. I repeated it until the words blurred. Then the radio crackled, at first just static. Then a voice too smooth to be anyone I'd ever known, yet layered with cadences of familiarity, like every friend I'd ever lost was speaking at once. Evan, just uncover one. Just one panel you need to see. You can't stay blind forever. I pushed the mic away. My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. The voice coaxed softer. It's safer if you look. We'll explain the peaks. We'll explain the ice. Just lift the blanket, let the night show you. I shoved my palms into my ears, but the voice pressed through the static, slipping under my skin. Your uncle looked, he understood. Don't you want to understand? The seconds bled toward 11:11. My phone's clock glowed on the desk, the numbers flipping like a countdown. I remembered rule #2, never answer after 11 p.m. But what was answering, picking up the mic, or just listening? My hand shook as I reached for the cord. If I ripped the radio out, maybe the voice would stop. Before I could move, the voice snapped sharp, urgent. "Evan, look behind you." The blankets trembled. The glass beyond them pulsed blacker than the forest night, as if something leaned close from outside. And then, impossibly, a handprint bloomed on the inside of the glass. Pale, perfectly human, pressed flat against the window from my side of the tower. It was the first sound of celebration I'd heard since arriving at the tower. A dull pop, then another, drifting faintly up the valley. I stepped to the eastern window and through the blanket caught the spill of light. Someone down in the county had strung lanterns and rigged fireworks for the fair. I could almost smell kettle corn, hear the scratchy music of a cover band trying their best with Tom Petty. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world still existed beyond these rules. Then the sky erupted in color. Every burst painted the glass. Reds, greens, silvers, the kind that hang a second too long. And in those reflections between the cracks of light, I saw things move. Not smoke, not drifting sparks, shapes, too tall, too thin, sliding from one tree line to another only in the split seconds of brightness. Every time the fireworks boomed, the reflections showed more. A procession maybe, or a hunt. I backed away from the window, telling myself not to look, but the noise pulled me closer. My heart thudded in rhythm with each blast. Then I heard it, a child's voice rising soft through the floorboards. "Uncle Evan." The words nearly broke me. I'd never been anyone's uncle. My sister's boy had died before he could speak, a crib accident no one in the family ever named out loud. Yet here in this tower under this sky, a child knew my name and title. "Uncle Evan," it pleaded again. "Come watch the fireworks with me." My throat locked. I staggered back, nearly knocking the lantern over. Outside, the finale began, gold willows pouring down in dazzling showers. For a moment the whole tower lit up in reflected flame. And that was when it happened. A glowing ember carried impossibly high on the still air, arced across the sky and dropped onto the catwalk railing. It landed, smoldered, and did not go out. The county fireworks were still smoldering in my head when I found the barometer. It sat mounted above the desk, brass rim dulled, but the needle still twitching with faint life. I'd barely noticed it before, just another relic nailed to the wall like the maps and yellowing safety posters. But now it felt alive. While digging through the bottom drawer, I found the lookout's old weather logs. They went back decades, neat handwriting marching line after line. Pressure readings, temperatures, eye conditions. It could have been 100 years of nothing. Except here and there, scrawled in the margins, were notes no meteorologist would write. Drop at dusk, Thomas vanished. Pressure collapse. Knock came with her voice, door splintered. Needle fell, counted only 8 peaks after. My throat dried as I traced the entries. Each disappearance, each breach matched a sudden barometric fall. It wasn't storms that shook this tower, it was them. Near the back of the ledger, a newer hand had taped in a rule, its paper yellowed like the others. If the barometer rises during lightning, go silent and face north. I stared at it, wondering how a rise could be worse than a fall. But the words hummed in my mind with the same weight all the rules carried, absolute, unyielding. That night the air grew strange. Too still, too warm, like the forest was holding its breath. Then the first lightning flash burned white across the ridge. But there was no thunder. The needle on the barometer crept upward, slowly, relentlessly. I froze, my skin prickled. The rule screamed inside me, "Go silent, face north." I turned stiffly toward the dark pane where the ridgeline lay, keeping my mouth clamped shut, every instinct begging me to scream. Another flash lit the world, so bright it etched every tree into afterimage. And for the first time, the 10th peak wasn't just visible through the Osborne lens. It glowed. The first wail rose just after midnight. It wasn't wind, it wasn't glass, it was a siren. High-pitched, keening, the kind mounted on firehouse roofs in small American towns, the kind that called every volunteer in the county out of bed when flames touched timber. I froze at the desk, pen in hand above the ledger. The sound went on and on and on. No cut-off, no cycle, just one endless note drilling through my skull like the whole valley had been set aflame. But when I stepped to the window, clutching the blanket edge, the night below was dark. No lights in the valley, no trucks tearing through streets, nothing. The siren was only for me. My chest seized. I was back in Spokane, the smell of scorched insulation, the feel of latex gloves sticking with sweat, a boy on a gurney, his airway closing, my hands fumbling for the tube, his mother screaming, my partner shouting numbers, and that terrible moment when the monitor flatlined anyway. The siren had gone on that night too, or maybe I'd carried it here with me. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the sound drilled through bone. The rules didn't cover this. There was no guidance for a siren that no one else could hear. Then I heard it change, from one long pitch to something modulated, almost like a voice braided into the sound. I leaned closer to the trapdoor while burning my throat. The siren wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the stairwell. Boots thudded against the landing, heavy, deliberate. I staggered back as a shadow filled the crack under the hatch, and then I saw it, a stretcher. It sat across the landing as though two invisible medics had just set it down. My gear from Spokane was strapped to it, jump bag, trauma shears, O2 cylinder, all of it splattered with old, dried blood, and the sheet pulled over the body bulged. Something underneath it moved. The wind had been my one companion. Even on the worst nights when glass went black or footsteps drummed the attic, there was always the hush of air moving through the pines, steady and grounding. It carried the smell of sap, the creak of branches. It reminded me the forest was real. So when it stopped, I noticed instantly. Not faded, not slowed, stopped. The kind of silence where your ears start ringing, desperate to fill the void. I bolted to the desk, searching the taped rules with shaking hands. Rule #8. I hadn't noticed it before, tucked low and scrawled in smaller ink. If the wind stops, hum. Don't stop until it returns. I swallowed hard, humming, that was it. But the memory of ice, of ash, of the glowing 10th peak told me better than to doubt. I forced sound out of my chest. A low, tuneless hum vibrating in my teeth. At first it felt absurd, like I was a child warding off monsters in a closet. But then the glass began to change. The panes darkened, not to mirror, not to shadow, but to liquid. The surface shimmered like stretched water, bulging inward as though something pressed its face against the other side. I hummed louder. My throat burned, my lips trembling. The watery sheen wavered, held in check by the sound. The seconds dragged, my lungs ached. I nearly stopped just to suck in a full breath, and that was when I heard it. From the trees below, soft, low, deliberate, something was humming back. Not mocking, not random. It found my note, matched it, and then slid into harmony. A duet. The glass rippled with each beat as if it approved. I clutched the desk edge, humming through tears, knowing that if I faltered, the window would melt away, and whatever was in the trees would come inside to finish the song. I hadn't slept since the humming. My throat was raw, lips cracked, voice shredded to nothing but a whisper. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that other voice, the one in the trees, curling back into harmony, waiting for me to start again. The tower was full of places I hadn't checked, corners I'd been too afraid to look at. The rules had taught me one thing: what you don't know can kill you. So I searched. That's how I found the false panel under the map table. At first it looked like ordinary plywood, old Forest Service maps tacked to the surface, corners curled from sun and time. But when I brushed my hand across the underside, I felt a groove. I pulled, and a drawer I hadn't known existed slid open with a sigh of dust. Inside lay a single ledger, different from the others. Its cover wasn't leather or cloth, but painted wood, lacquered dark. On the front, burned into the surface, was a name: Hector R. 1891. My hand shook as I opened it. The handwriting inside was tight, disciplined, a soldier's script. The first page was a title: Why the Lookout Exists. I read, my pulse pounding. This station was never built for fires. It was built along a seam, a place where the ground tore before we arrived. They called it a gap, a thinning. The peaks are not mountains but masks, ridges placed by whatever came before us to hold the tear shut. Each time one vanishes, the seam widens. I gripped the pages harder, forcing myself not to look toward the windows. The next section was worse. The radio was never ours. It speaks with their borrowed tongues. It offers bargains. It is the seam reaching through, luring guardians to give consent. Do not answer. Do not name it. Silence is survival. The hairs on my neck prickled. I remembered every time I'd almost lifted the mic, every time I'd heard Lillian's voice bleeding through static. Further down, Hector's writing trembled. If I fail, the seam will choose another of blood, always the blood. If I fail, it chooses you. If you fail, it chooses her. I turned the page and something slipped free. A photograph. Sepia-toned, edges brittle. A little boy in overalls stood in a backyard I recognized, his dark hair sticking up the way my sister always joked about. My stomach dropped. It was my sister's son. The child I'd buried in grief and guilt, the family I thought I'd lost to accident and silence. And on the back of the photo, scrawled in Hector's same rigid hand, were 3 words: It knows him. August should have been smoke season. Every lookout in the Northwest knew it. Late summer dried the forest to tinder. Lightning strikes turned ridges into torches, and the sky usually wore a haze the color of ash. But here the valley stretched clean, crisp, empty. I could see every tree line like it had been cut from glass. Not a wisp, not a smudge. Still, the valley scanner on the desk crackled to life. Columns rising east of Silt Creek, 3 confirmed plumes near the canyon lip. I leaned forward. The voice was official, clipped, exactly the tone of the Forest Service dispatchers I remembered from ride-alongs. I checked the ridge through the Osborne lens. Nothing. Just green forest rolling quiet beneath a clear sky. Another report. Smoke 2 miles north of Raker Ridge, expanding fast. Advise caution. My gut twisted. Either every dispatcher had lost their mind or I had. By nightfall, the radio was frantic. 5 columns now, spot fires joining, evacuations possible. I dragged the blanket from one pane and forced myself to look. At first, still nothing, no fire, no haze, the valley dark and empty. Then the glass shifted, not mirror black, not liquid this time, something else. Through the reflection of the cabin lights, smoke columns bloomed. Churning towers, black as storms, rising from places I knew were clear. Fire everywhere, but only in the glass. And in those columns, shapes writhed, long arms pulling themselves upward as though the smoke was rope. I dropped the blanket, stumbling back. The reports on the scanner overlapped, chaotic, voices all shouting about flames that didn't exist except when I looked wrong. That was when I heard the first bolt snap. I spun toward the trapdoor. I'd chained it shut hours ago, double-checked the lock. Now the chain was lifting link by link, as though something below was pushing the door from its hinges. Wood groaned. The iron latch bent. The trapdoor was opening. The trapdoor gave with a shriek of wood. The chain tore loose, and then they came. Two figures climbed into the room like mirrored nightmares of each other. The first wore the ranger cardigan I remembered from town. His eyes were soft, his voice gentle. "Evan," he said, almost pleading, "you've carried this burden long enough. Let me help. Let me take the watch tonight." The second was the same body, the same cardigan, but sagging with rot. Skin slipped from his cheekbones. His mouth hung in tatters. Flies crawled across his collar. They moved together step for step. Both raised their hands toward me. Fingers too long, joints bending wrong, extending until they brushed the floorboards like strands of wet rope. "Exchange," they said in perfect unison. One voice soothing, the other gurgling with decay. "One guardian for another. Step outside and you are free." I backed away, my spine hitting the cold glass of the north window. The blankets shifted as if they wanted to fall. In the reflection I saw the catwalk, but it wasn't the catwalk anymore. Wherever I looked, every side of the tower now opened into forest. Endless tree line, dark and humming in every direction. The catwalks didn't face the valley. They faced something else entirely. The Whitlows tilted their heads in sync, too much kindness in one, too much hunger in the other. "Step out," the kind one urged. "Step out," the rotting one echoed, lips tearing wider as he spoke. The choice was a noose tightening around me. Stay here with them, two predators in the shape of my only guide, or step onto a catwalk that led nowhere but deeper into the trees that were not trees. My knees buckled. My hands slid along the desk edge until they found the ledger. Hector's words burned in my skull. "If I fail, it chooses you. If you fail, it chooses him." I couldn't step out, so I turned. The stairwell gaped below me, dark and too deep. My boot landed on the first step, then another. I counted under my breath, desperate, clinging to the rhythm. 7, 8, 9, then another, 10. There should not have been a 10th step, but I kept going. Down into the dark, choosing the stairwell that no longer matched the tower I thought I knew. The 10th step gave way to a landing I had never seen before. A narrow door opened easily under my palm, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside stretched a room that shouldn't have fit beneath the tower. Low stone walls lined with shelves, cupboards stuffed with books, journals stacked in uneven towers. Some were leather, some canvas, some just stapled sheaves of paper gone brittle with time. The air smelled of dust and pine pitch, but also ink, centuries of it. I ran my lantern across the spines. Each bore a name, some I didn't recognize, some I did: Hector, Marcus, Whitlow, dozens more guardians I had never been told existed, each one leaving behind their testament. At the back sat a small brass box with a tiny keyhole, one that finally matched the third key. I turned it. The lock yielded with a soft, grateful click. Inside lay blank ledgers and a stub of pencil wrapped in oilcloth, as if someone had planned for this exact moment. I sat on the floor and opened a blank ledger. The paper crackled under my pen as I wrote. Not just the old rules, but the new ones I'd learned in terror. If the wind stops, hum. Don't let the glass turn to water. If they come wearing the faces of family, remember, they know only what you remember. Don't give them more. When the stair count drifts, don't trust your feet, trust the rhythm of your own breath. And then I added one more, one Hector and Marcus had never thought to write. If a child ever comes to this place, leave a safe protocol. Don't let them face what we did. Give them a way to survive, even if it costs you. My hand cramped, but I kept writing until the dawn bled gray against the slit windows. For the first time in days, I felt no panic, no pounding heart, just a heavy certainty settling in my chest. I was the keeper now. When I climbed back into the cab, the tower felt different, like it had been holding its breath and finally let it out. The trapdoor rested flat. The chain lay coiled, unbroken. The windows glowed with simple morning light. And outside, life. I saw it through the Osborne lens like a postcard. The Little League diamond in the far valley, kids running bases in uniforms too big for them. Church bells tolling faintly from a white steeple. Diesel pickups rumbling to work along a two-lane road. Perfectly normal, perfectly American. I almost wept, but the tower reminded me. Always the rules, always the ritual. So I filled the enamel cup, set it carefully on the north sill where the light was brightest, and began to hum. Not the dirge of the trees, not the harmony of whatever waited in the woods. A tune from my childhood. The lullaby my sister used to sing when the house was too quiet and the dark too loud. The notes trembled out of me, soft and unsteady, but they held. The cup shimmered faintly in the dawn, and the tower exhaled once more, satisfied.